Sí, estos son buenos plátanos. ¡Ay, Dios mío!
Being such a significant IP to Nintendo's power and fame, you'd think DK would be Nintendo royalty, but they have not given this franchise the same attention in recent years that other Nintendo franchises have enjoyed, making Bonanza a bigger deal than most people realize. This game is not only the first new entry in the series since Google Plus existed, it is also the first new 3D Donkey Kong in over 25 years. But why did it take so long for this to happen? Barring remasters, there was a bigger gap for Donkey Kong than Metroid, or Wario, or even Star Fox, and he outsells all of these individuals. I understand why certain franchises take a hike, but why him? You see, Nintendo has not developed a Donkey Kong game since Donkey Kong Jungle Beat in 2004. That's 20 years of bouncing the IP around to retro studios, Power, Capcom, and Namco. Simply put, there hasn't been a dedicated Donkey Kong developer like HAL for Kirby literally ever. Rare and Retro would be the closest we ever got to that, but unfortunately the former was swallowed up by the jaws of Satan and the latter had no interest in assuming this role. Retro Studios in general has been kinda absent after Tropical Freeze, and so while that silence was broken, everyone was kinda wondering exactly how an entire generation managed to escape their grasp. The answer to that doesn't lie in Metroid Prime, but more so a separate secret game and IP that got cancelled within Retro. At some point after 2014, Retro got right onto making a new original game for the Switch, a game we vaguely knew about through LinkedIn profiles and rumors for years up until this April when a prototype leaked online, named Harmony. And I'm just speculating here, but to my eyes, Harmony looks pretty damn adjacent to Bonanza, which has insane implications and would imply that Retro actually did have a role in that title. But we don't know enough to make that judgment, so I'm not gonna go there and simply say this game never materialized. So all that development time was wasted, and because they would get right onto Prime 4 soon after, it's clear Retro was likely never willing to do another Donkey Kong. But nevertheless, we're definitely going to be going over Nintendo's various studios and why each one wouldn't be making Donkey Kong in a little bit, but to reel back to what I was talking about with all the DK games made in the past 30 years, the sole exception here is that the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games were actually all made in-house. Yeah, in-house by none other than Nintendo Software Technology, aka Nintendo of America. Sure, these games are at their core spiritual successors to that original arcade game, but like, come on, there is clearly more Mario than Donkey Kong inside the DNA of these spin-offs. I just need to stress how crazy it is that before that, the last time Nintendo was directly leading a Donkey Kong game was the fucking 80s. And also this one Game Boy game and half Donkey Konga, but that undermines my point, so I don't care. In the 90s, Donkey Kong was, of course, all done by Rare. Now, Rare is British. What the fuck were they thinking? No, seriously, what were they thinking? They gave Donkey Kong to a random British studio, and not only that, they let them reboot and redesign Donkey Kong. With hindsight, this was obviously a smart choice as the country games are iconic and carved out the modern lore, but it does prove two things. One, that other franchises have always been, and were simply more important to Nintendo, and therefore a priority to the actual developers making the games, despite DK having good sales, which I should point out is relatively unusual. And two, that Nintendo of Japan has just straight up not known what to do with Donkey Kong for decades, having to pass the controller over to different companies. Imagine how confused these guys had to be to allow British people to psychologically experiment on one of their biggest icons. So when Retro decided to stop in 2014, what reason would Nintendo have to continue? Well, because Donkey Kong is more important to them than people think, because Bonanza wasn't the first attempt at a new 3D Donkey Kong in the last 10 years. What if I told you that the developer of Skylanders, Guitar Hero, Crash, and Tony Hawk, the person, were in charge of making a new Donkey Kong game? Would you cry like a little bitch? Back in 2015, Nintendo and Activision kissed each other on the mouth in Skylanders Superchargers, producing a Donkey Kong Bowser DLC developed by Vicarious Visions. Nintendo and mainly Shigeru Miyamoto, liked it so much that they were willing to hear Vicarious Visions out when being pitched a 3D Donkey Kong. Obviously, it was a success, but freedom only lasted approximately 6 months. 6 months is all this game had, being created with the aim of landing on Switch with Nintendo on board. It wasn't some game that might have happened, it was going to happen. Shiggy was involved in the process, man. Ultimately, Donkey Kong Freedom would fall through in early 2016 because we don't deserve to be happy. Activision didn't want to give Vicarious Visions any semblance of, ironically, freedom, and not allowing them to escape the Call of Duty / Destiny / Diablo minds, which was precisely where ActiBliz wanted them. A company that couldn't see the value in working with Nintendo to make a monkey game. Evil. There was a big interest on both sides in pushing the game forward. How could this fail? Who would sabotage that? Surely only the most lifeless, blood-sucking, filthy parasite would want to deprive the world of What you're seeing on screen is pretty much the only concept art that was salvaged from this process. From here though, we can theorize what release date the game would have had. Now, modern games don't just start being made and then poop out the next month, and unlike the rest of the industry, Switch games have tended to take around 2 to 4 years. There are exceptions, Tears of the Kingdom, Bayonetta 3, etc., but their internal studios are generally in a state of rotation. Going back to Donkey Kong, we have 3 factors to consider, those being COVID, possibly making other games, and the fact that production had already begun. So it seems sensible to place Freedom at either mid-2020 or 2021, which, fits nicely when you look at that timeline. Not that these 2 years were necessarily barren for the Switch, but COVID definitely did a number. You pretty much just had a Warriors game, some re-releases, and Mario Kart Live Circuit, which, by the way, was made by the people who were in charge of Vicarious Visions for the holiday of 2020, as well as Bowser's Fury the following year in February. After Monster Hunter, Nintendo was mainly releasing low-key titles for at least half a year. I am willing to bet that this gap right here was the very lack of a 3D Donkey Kong. And alright, when you take a step back and go back to the question of this video, I think 6 to 7 years would be a very acceptable gap for a Donkey Kong game. I'd imagine the ultimate reason Nintendo didn't pick this idea back up off the shelf immediately was because they do seem to like continuing natural partnerships and not force things, unless it's Pokemon. Then the Nintendo pimp comes out. To get back on track, I am trying to paint a picture wherein Nintendo clearly didn't plan for Donkey Kong to be ignored for this long. However, it is the natural consequence of passing an IP over to various developers for decades. There is nothing to suggest that the Japanese teams really wanted anything to do with Donkey Kong, especially when the only Nintendo developed DK stuff after Jungle Beat happened to be coming from America. Obviously, this is no longer true, as I doubt the EPD team would be doing Bonanza if there wasn't a genuine passion and interest. Which brings me to my next point, being, realistically, who else could have possibly made a Donkey Kong game after 2014, and what were Nintendo Studios even doing? In 2014, Next Level Games was likely making Federation Force and would go on to do Luigi's Mansion 3. Of all of Nintendo's external studios, I'd say Next Level are the ones who could have taken a crack at a Donkey Kong. They have experience with the overall IP, are a Western company, and seem flexible enough in that they can nail different types of games, or that they don't just act as a support studio. But naturally, the studio's passions lie with making Luigi shit himself, and they did have the important role of disappointing everyone in time for the World Cup. Nintendo Cube, fetish name, pretty much just deals with Mario parties, so at most, we'd see a DK party game, but really, I don't know if these are the guys to deal with that IP. HAL Laboratory live and breathe Kirby, so I do doubt they want to be torn away from their bread and butter, especially after finally embracing 3D, but being a developer of cartoony platformers, it's certainly possible for HAL to make something with the Kong franchise. Who knows, maybe they're making the next 2D Donkey Kong. Camelot has been in a weirdo Mario Sports dungeon sweatshop making golf and tennis the past 10 years. I think they like it. So hear me out. Donkey Kong Volleyball, 1 billion Switch 2s immediately. Intelligent Systems has always made Fire Emblem, WarioWare, Advance Wars, Codename Steam, Pushmo, Paper Mario, probably the fucking universe too. At first glance you'd think, man, these guys are pretty clever, smart, perhaps even Intelligent. They could handle a Kong game, they do a lot, but Intelligent Systems is not the action game platformer type. They are the slow, methodical strategy or mini-game type. Not really ripe for Donkey Kong, unless we're finally getting X-Kong. Monolith Soft are obviously the Xeno team, but have actually had their fingers in quite a lot of Nintendo games, offering technical expertise, meaning I could see them helping with the environments/graphics for a Donkey Kong title, but just that, because I just can't for a second believe that anything could possibly shake Monolith's conviction toward making anime catgirls. Game Freak makes Little Town Hero. Now there are others I could mention, but those are either support studios or weird partnerships like Platinum Games. So really, no one here could have feasibly picked up the mantle, but honestly, the question is, would they even be able to pull it off? I just don't think the various studios really would have it in them to make the Donkey Kong game fans would want. Retro Studios going from an explorative puzzle FPS to a 2D platformer was kind of a unique situation, as most studios do specialize for one specific brand of game. Returns had 3 games to follow up on, but they doubled as slightly outdated blueprints that could inform their transition, and it shows while playing Returns because no one had that expectation of exactly what a modern country game was supposed to look like. While a new 2D game would have to follow up Tropical Freeze, which would be no easy task, and a modern 3D Donkey Kong would be an even bigger undertaking. Then we have Nintendo's bloody red guts, Nintendo EPD. EPD is 2 separate buildings, those being Nintendo EPD Kyoto and Nintendo EPD Tokyo. EPD is made up of a bunch of production groups, but only 10 are relevant here. So I want to go over what each group does and theorize on why that team wouldn't be doing Donkey Kong. Don't worry, all the information comes from a reliable source. Wikipedia and Reddit, they never lie. First up is Core Production Group, who assist in producing and leading external games like Fire Emblem, Bayonetta, or Mario and Luigi, and are emerging of Production Group 1 and 2. Seemingly, CPG do not make games of their own, just go develop, so in regards to DK, I guess they'd be working with Vicarious Visions if that deal didn't fall through. Production Group 3 makes the big boy Zelda games. They should replace Link with Kiddy Kong. That's all I got. Production Group 4 dabbles in all the weird gimmicky chaos, and think Ring Fit and Labor. Now, that does make me think these guys could have totally fucking nailed a Donkey Konga, but instead, Production Group 4 would spend their time on Game Builder Garage and everybody want to switch. Miyamoto's gotta start eviscerating people, man. Production Group 5 is Animal Crossing and Splatoon. Not that Donkey Kong sells bad, but imagine trying to convince these people they should make a monkey climbing simulator. They do you like Mussolini, like, no man. They are making cheddar, you jabroni. Obviously, Animal Crossing and Splatoon are gonna have a way higher priority, but perhaps they could assist in making a spin-off, at the most. Production Groups 6 and 7 are similar to Core Production Group, but I would imagine possess more agency, because these two are less spread out and mainly do work with Metroid, a series that has been on both fronts in constant development since 2016, which again was actually right when Freedom got cancelled. 6 was helping Next Level and Intelligent while also doing Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Prime Remastered with Retro. So unless either of those studios decided they were doing a DK game, it wasn't going to be happening with 6, and the same basically goes for 7 too. Then we get to the big one, the usual suspect, the culprit, the brilliant bastards who we know are in fact doing Bonanza. Production Group 8, who I should specify, is EPD Tokyo. Pretty much every other group resides within the Kyoto building. Obviously, Group 8 did Odyssey, 3D World, and Bowser's Fury, and 3D All-Stars. EPD Tokyo just makes so much damn sense for Bonanza. You know, first there was a rumor back in 2018 and then again in 2021. Second, a development building for this production group to expand development is being constructed for 2027. And this is just my speculation, but I am willing to bet that this shit is gonna be the Donkey Kong house. Third, it has been 8 years since Odyssey, a game that was made in 4 years. Fourth, eyes. We all have eyes. It was so damn obvious. Moving on, Group 9 are the developers of Mario Kart, ARMS, and Todd. The most you can imagine them doing would perhaps be Diddy Kong Racing, but I think creating content for Todd throughout the Switch era, then doing the booster course, and also making Mario Kart World in time for the Switch 2 launch was likely a lot on their plate. And finally, Group 10 do 2D Mario and Pikmin, which it wouldn't have been the most unlikely scenario to see them produce a 2D Donkey Kong. Unlike most of the studios I've discussed, I feel like they would certainly have the perfect skill set. However, I feel getting a 2D Mario out was simply far more important, considering both the 11-year gap and the movie. The point to take away from all this is that you can't just tell any developer to do something and expect it to happen in the best results like Nintendo so often delivers. It's easy to say Nintendo should have gotten somebody to do it, but that's not how the reality of game development works. You can't force things unless there is money to be made. Enter Seth Rogen. Wow! Yeah! It's clear now that the movie and the park were major drivers to it taking this long for DK to receive his huge game, mainly because they all know when these things are gonna happen in advance. Nintendo likes timing, and so the minute that DK Park was set in stone, the minute they knew the Mario movie's general release date, nothing was gonna happen. So was to allow Mario's year of narcissism to bloom. However, it definitely wasn't the only factor. Between not having a proper DK studio available to requiring focus on other important franchises to the Activision deal that fell apart to finally receiving a good reason to invest in monkeys, it unfortunately makes sense that it took this long for Donkey Kong to return 3D. Ultimately, while all of this, yes, it shows somewhat of a neglect of the IP over the past 30 years, it also shows that Nintendo is just on another level when it comes to making games. This is exactly what people have wanted, and I remind you, people fucking suck. However, I feel that unless they truly have a dedicated team that will now focus on Donkey Kong stuff, this game may just be the exception, meaning we'll have to wait a while for anything new. In other words, I'd kill myself if I was an F-Zero fan.